The contract was the problem. The contract was always the problem. Nora Callahan had read it so many times. The paper had gone soft at the folds. The ink faded where her fingers had pressed and pressed again, searching for the words that would save her. They were not there. She had looked for them the way a person looks for water in a dry creek bed, with absolute certainty that water had once been there, and with growing despair that it was not there now. Harlan's Crossing, Nevada, 1887. A town that had grown up fast around a silver strike and never quite grown up the rest of the way. There was one church, one jail, one general store, 2 saloons, and a boarding house that sat at the far end of Alderman Street like something that had been there before the town and would be there long after. The boarding house was called the Callahan House because the Callahans had built it, and for 11 years it had been the most decent place a traveler could sleep between Reno and the Utah border. Clean sheets, warm meals, no trouble. Nora ran it alone now. Her mother had died in the spring of 1885, 2 weeks after her father. And the grief had come down on Nora like a second ceiling, low and close and airless. She was 23 years old. She had 6 rooms to let, a kitchen garden, a mule named Patience, and a ledger that balanced if she was careful and didn't balance if she wasn't. She was always careful. What she did not have was the deed. She had never thought to look for it. Why would she? The Callahan house was the Callahan house. Her grandfather had laid the first log. Her father had added the east wing. Her mother had planted the roses along the front porch that came back every June without being asked. The deed was a piece of paper. The house was a fact. It was Aldous Marsh who taught her that a piece of paper could unmake a fact. Aldous Marsh was not the sheriff of Harlan's Crossing. He was not the mayor. He held no office and wore no badge, and had never, as far as anyone could prove, broken a law. What he was the man who held the paper on nearly everything worth holding in that county: the timber rights, the water contract for the southern farms, the lien on the livery stable, a half interest in the better of the 2 saloons. He was 51 years old, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of face that looked reasonable and patient, right up until the moment it didn't. He sat on the church council. He gave money to the school. He had a wife named Margaret, who wore her hair very neatly and never met anyone's eyes at the market. In October of 1887, Aldous Marsh came to Nora Callahan with a piece of paper and told her, in a tone he might have used to read a grocery list, that the Callahan house belonged to him. He said her father had borrowed $400 from him in the spring of 1884 to repair the east wing roof after a winter collapse, and had signed over the property as collateral. He said the debt had never been repaid. He said he had been patient, given the circumstances of her parents' deaths, but that patience had its limits. He laid the contract on her kitchen table and stepped back and folded his hands and waited. Nora looked at the paper for a long time. Then she looked up at him. "My father never borrowed money from you," she said. "The contract says he did. My father paid for that roof repair himself. I remember it. We ate beans for 6 weeks. Memory is a fragile thing, Miss Callahan. That's my father's signature?" "It is." She looked at it again. The signature looked right. The way the C looped, the way the H dropped below the line. It looked exactly right, and that was the thing that frightened her most. Not that it was wrong, but that she could not prove it was wrong. She did not know enough about her father's hand to say where it was right, and where it was a very good imitation of right. She was not a lawyer. She was a woman who ran a boarding house and kept a clean ledger and planted beans when the money was short. "I'll need time," she said. "You have 30 days, Aldous Marsh said. "After that, I'll need the key." He left without finishing the coffee she had not offered him. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time after he was gone. The contract was still on the table. She did not touch it. Outside, Patience made a sound in the yard, and the roses scraped against the porch rail in a small wind, and the light moved across the floor the way it always had, unhurried and indifferent, as if nothing had changed. She picked up the contract. She read it again. Then she folded it exactly as it had been folded, and put it in the tin box where she kept important papers, and she went and started supper, because there were 3 guests in the house, and they would be hungry at 6 o'clock, whether Aldous Marsh existed or not. That was the first day. In the days that followed, Nora did what she could. She went to the county clerk's office and asked to see the records for the Callahan property. The clerk, a small man named Fenwick who wore the same green vest every day of his life, went to find the file and came back and told her, apologetically, that there seemed to be some irregularity. The original deed was not in its usual place, and a replacement document had been filed in its stead. She asked who had filed it. He told her, with the expression of a man who already knew this conversation was going to cause him trouble, that the filing had been authorized by Aldous Marsh. She went to the lawyer, a man named Peabody who had an office above the general store. Peabody listened to her carefully, looked at the contract, looked at her, and told her that the signature was, in his opinion, consistent with her father's hand, as he had known it. He told her that contesting the contract would require evidence, and that evidence was the one thing she did not have. He told her, gently, that she might consider whether there was a reasonable arrangement to be made with Mr. Marsh, perhaps a rent arrangement. Perhaps something could be worked out. She thanked him and went back down the stairs. She went to the sheriff, a man named Briggs, who had held the office for 9 years and who owed his last 2 election victories to Aldous Marsh's financial support. Briggs heard her out. He was not unkind. He told her civil disputes were not his territory, that she needed a court, not a sheriff, and that the circuit judge came through Harlan's Crossing twice a year and was not due again until March. It was October. She did the arithmetic and said nothing and went home. That night she sat at the kitchen table with a lamp and the tin box open in front of her, and she went through every piece of paper her parents had ever kept: letters, receipts, a bill of sale for patients, dated 1881, her mother's recipe for cornbread, written in pencil on the back of an envelope, the certificate of her parents' marriage, her own birth record, a photograph of her father standing in front of the boarding house in 1876, squinting into the sun, one hand on the porch post. No deed, no receipt for the roof repair, no record of any transaction with Aldous Marsh. She closed the tin box and sat in the quiet kitchen and listened to the house settle around her, the creak of the roof timber, the hiss of the lamp, the way the wind came under the back door and moved across the floor in cold currents. She had been listening to those sounds her whole life. She knew this house the way she knew her own heartbeat, not because she had studied it, but because it had simply always been there, underneath everything else. She was not going to let a piece of paper take it. The question was how. It was the second week of October when Rafe Decker arrived at the Callahan house. He came in on the afternoon stage, which was unusual for a man who traveled alone and carried nothing but a saddlebag and a rifle. Most men who arrived on the stage were merchants or salesmen, or men on their way to somewhere else. Rafe Decker had the look of a man who had been in many somewheres and was not particularly attached to any of them. He was tall, lean through the face, with the kind of quiet that was not emptiness, but attention, as if he were listening to something no one else could quite hear. He paid for a week in advance, in coin, without being asked. He thanked Nora for the room in a way that was brief and not performative. He ate supper with the other guests and said very little and listened a great deal and helped clear the table without being asked. In 11 years of running a boarding house, Nora had learned to read people fast. She read Rafe Decker as a man who had seen enough of the world to have stopped being surprised by it. She did not tell him about the contract. She did not tell him about anything. But the Callahan house was not a large building, and walls carried sound, and Nora was not the only person who had business with Aldous Marsh. On the third day, she was in the kitchen when she heard Marsh's voice in the front room, where he had come. She realized, to check on the progress of her departure. The door was not fully closed. She stood still in the kitchen, and she heard Marsh tell the empty air, because he had expected Nora, and found instead only the entryway, that the house would make a fine addition to his holdings. She heard him stop. She heard the floor creak twice, and then silence. She came out of the kitchen and found the front room empty, and Rafe Decker standing at the bottom of the stairs. He looked at her. She looked at him. He did not ask what he had just heard. He did not ask anything. He just went upstairs to his room, and closed the door, and she went back to the kitchen and finished the bread she had been making, and tried to remember the last time anyone in Harlan's Crossing had looked at her as if she were simply a person and not a problem. On the fourth day, she found a note under her door. It said, "The man who repaired your roof in the spring of 1884. What was his name?" She stared at the note for a full minute. Then she went upstairs and knocked on the door of room 3. Rafe Decker opened it. "Silas Pruitt," she said. He ran a carpentry shop on the north end of town. He moved to California the following year. Rafe nodded once. "Do you have his address?" she asked. "I might be able to find it." She looked at him for a moment. He had given her nothing to work with, no explanation, no promise, no speech about right and wrong. Just a question and the beginning of an idea. "Why?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Because he keeps doing it, and everyone keeps letting him." That was all he said. She nodded and went back downstairs. He was gone for 3 days. He left on the morning stage, and he did not say when he would be back, and he left his things in room 3, which she took as a sign that he intended to return. In those 3 days, Aldous Marsh came by twice. The first time, he reminded her that she was now at the 3-week mark, and that she should be making arrangements. The second time, he brought a man with him, a heavy-set man who stood in the yard and looked at the east wing with the evaluating expression of someone who was already measuring it for changes. She stood on the porch and watched them and said nothing. That night, she allowed herself to be afraid for the first time. Not the managed, working kind of fear that had been keeping her moving and thinking and baking bread and doing laundry. The other kind. The kind that came when you finally stopped moving and let the dark in. She sat on the edge of her bed and she thought about where she would go, and found that she had no answer. And then she put the thought away because it was not useful, and she went to sleep. On the morning of the 4th day, Rafe Decker came back. He had a letter. It was from Silas Pruitt, written in the labored hand of a man who did not write often, but understood the importance of precision when he did. It said that in April of 1884, he had performed roof repair work on the Callahan house on Alderman Street in Harlan's Crossing, Nevada. It said that he had been paid in full upon completion by a Mr. Thomas Callahan. It said that no third party had been involved in the transaction. It said that Mr. Callahan had paid in cash $47, and that the receipt had been written in the back of Pruitt's order book, a copy of which he enclosed. The copy was there, in Silas Pruitt's handwriting, $47. The 14th of April, 1884. Thomas Callahan, paid in full. Nora held the letter and the receipt copy for a long time. "It's not enough," she said. "He'll say Pruitt is mistaken. He'll say my father paid Pruitt and still borrowed from him. He'll say..." "There's something else," Rafe said. He had been in Sacramento, as it turned out, not just for the letter. He had also been to the county recorder's office there, where a man named Aldous Marsh had filed a suspiciously similar lien against a widow named Vera Hollis in 1883, claiming a property debt from her deceased husband. That case had gone to court. Vera Hollis had lost her house. The lawyer who had represented Marsh in that case had since moved to Reno and had, in the past year, expressed privately to at least one colleague that he was not proud of the work. Rafe had that too, in writing. "You've been busy," Nora said. "He's done this before," Rafe said. "A judge needs to know that." She looked at him. He was standing by the window of her kitchen, the morning light coming in flat and pale behind him, and he had the same quality he'd had since the day he arrived, the quality of a man who was entirely present and entirely unhurried, as if he had decided this was where he was supposed to be, and the decision required no further discussion. "The circuit judge doesn't come until March," she said. "I know, I spoke to the county seat. Given the nature of the evidence, and the property irregularity at the clerk's office, the missing original deed, they can convene a special hearing. It requires a formal request. A written statement from you, filed with the county." He paused. "It requires you to sign your name and state for the record that the contract is fraudulent." "That's not a small thing," she said. "No." She thought about the east wing. She thought about the man in the yard with the measuring eyes. She thought about Vera Hollis, who she had never met, who had lost her house in 1883, and who had probably sat in her own kitchen, just like this, holding evidence that was almost enough, and not quite enough, and trying to calculate the distance between almost and enough. "All right," she said. The hearing was scheduled for the first week of November. Aldous Marsh did not appear troubled when he was informed. He came by the boarding house on the last day of October, and he told Nora, in the same grocery list tone, that she was making a mistake she would not be able to walk back from. He told her that the county was a small place, and that people had long memories. He told her that whatever she thought she had, it was not going to be enough. She offered him coffee. He declined. He left. She went back to the kitchen and started supper. The morning of the hearing was cold. There had been frost the night before, the first of the season, and the road was iron-hard and bright, the sky above it high and pale and absolutely clear. Nora dressed carefully. She wore the blue wool dress she had worn to her mother's funeral, which was the best dress she owned, and she put her hair up and pinned it and looked at herself in the mirror above the washstand for one moment, not with vanity, but with a kind of deliberate steadiness, the way a person sets their feet before stepping into a current. She picked up the tin box. She walked to the courthouse. The hearing room was small and cold and smelled of wood smoke and old paper. There were perhaps 15 people in the gallery, which surprised her. She had not expected anyone to come. She recognized two of the farmers from the South Road, a woman named Agnes Teller who ran the millinery, the clerk Fenwick in his green vest, two men she did not know, and, in the back row, Rafe Decker, who sat with his hat on his knee and said nothing. Aldous Marsh sat at the opposing table with his lawyer, a man from Elko who wore a suit that was too fine for the room. The judge was a woman. This surprised everyone. Her name was the Honorable Cecilia Vane, and she had been appointed to the special hearing by the county seat, and she came in with the brisk efficiency of someone who had been underestimated many times and found it useful. She sat down. She put on her reading glasses. She opened the file. The lawyer from Elko made his case for Marsh. The contract was valid. The debt was real. The signature had been verified by a local attorney. The property had been properly refiled with the county. Everything was in order. Then Nora spoke. She had not practiced what she was going to say. She had tried, the night before, sitting at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and a pen, and the words had come out stiff and procedural, and not like her. So she had put the paper away and gone to bed and decided she would say what was true, in the order it was true, and let that be enough. She said her father had never borrowed money from Aldous Marsh. She said she remembered the winter the roof collapsed and the spring it was repaired, and she remembered eating beans, and she remembered her father's face when the repair was finally done, the particular way he had looked at the east wing, with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had paid his own way. She said she had the receipt from the man who did the work. She said she had evidence that Aldous Marsh had done this before, in Sacramento County, to a woman named Vera Hollis in 1883. She put the letter from Silas Pruitt on the table. She put the receipt copy on the table. She put the documentation from Sacramento on the table. She said, "The truth does not need anything except for someone to be willing to look at it." The room was very quiet when she finished. The lawyer from Elko objected to the Sacramento evidence as irrelevant. Judge Vane looked at him over her reading glasses and told him she would be the one to determine relevance. She read everything, all of it. She read it the way a person reads something they intend to understand, not something they intend to dispatch. The room waited. Aldous Marsh sat very still. He had the expression of a man recalculating. Judge Vane removed her reading glasses. She looked at the contract. She looked at the signature. She looked up. She said that the receipt from Silas Pruitt, combined with the Sacramento pattern, constituted sufficient grounds to void the contract as potentially fraudulent, pending a full investigation by the county prosecutor's office. She said the property deed would be restored to its original filing. She said that Aldous Marsh was ordered to have no further contact with Miss Nora Callahan or the Callahan house property pending the outcome of that investigation. She said it in the tone of a person reading a grocery list. The room was still quiet for a moment. Then Agnes Teller, in the third row, started clapping. One of the farmers joined her, then the other. Nora sat very still and looked at the table in front of her and breathed. She heard Marsh stand up. She heard his chair scrape back. She did not look at him. She heard him and his lawyer leave, their footsteps quick and diminished, and then the door, and then the cold air from outside, and then the door closing again. She picked up the papers from the table and put them back in the tin box, one by one, carefully, the way she had always handled things that mattered. The letter from Silas Pruitt, the receipt copy, the Sacramento documents, the contract. She put the contract in last. It was still soft at the folds. She closed the tin box and latched it. When she turned around, the room was slowly filling with sound, again people moving, talking, the particular noise of a place returning to itself after something has happened. Agnes Teller caught her eye and smiled. Fenwick nodded from under his green vest. One of the farmers, she did not know, touched the brim of his hat. She walked out of the courthouse into the November morning. The cold hit her like a fact. The frost was still on the north side of the road, in the shadow of the building, glittering and exact. The sky was the same high and pale and clear, the same as it had been before she went in, indifferent to what had or hadn't happened. Rafe Decker was standing on the steps. He did not say anything for a moment. Neither did she. "Thank you," she said finally. He turned his hat in his hands once. "You did it," he said. "I just found a man in California." She almost laughed. She did not quite laugh. She looked out at Alderman Street, at the far end of which she could see the front porch of the Callahan house, the roses brown now, but still there, still holding on in the November cold, the way roses did. "Are you staying?" she said. She said it without looking at him, which made it easier. He was quiet for a moment. "I think I might," he said. "If the room's still available." "It's still available," she said. She started down the steps. He fell in beside her at a pace that matched hers exactly, and they walked back down Alderman Street in the cold, bright morning, the frost crunching under their boots, the boarding house growing larger ahead of them with each step. Inside, there would be bread to start, and guests to feed, and a ledger to balance. And the mule, Patience waiting in the yard with her particular brand of patient complaint, and the east wing casting its shadow across the garden, just as it always had, just as her grandfather had intended, just as it would go on doing. The tin box was under her arm. The deed, the real one, restored now to its rightful place in the county record, had her name on it. Her name, and no one else's. She went up the porch steps. She opened the front door. She did not look back at the town behind her, or at the courthouse, or at anything that had happened. She went inside, and she started the day. Sometimes the only thing standing between you and what is rightfully yours is the willingness to keep going one more day, to find one more receipt, ask one more question, knock on one more door. Nora didn't need rescuing. She needed someone to believe the truth was worth looking for, and she chose to be that person first. The help arrived because she didn't stop. It usually does. A small note for you: this story was created and fictionalized by AI, written to bring you a moment of entertainment and, perhaps, a quiet reminder that honest, persistent courage has a way of finding exactly the help it needs.